Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of our xAPI cohort. My name is David Kelly. I'm the CEO of the Learning Guild, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this week's session, exploring how we send xAPI data. And we are welcoming Paul Schneider from Domino, who's going to help us on that. But before we go through into today's session, that I'm very much looking forward to, I wanted to give you a few reminders about some of the other stuff that's going on in terms of the xAPI cohort and how we're hosting xAPI within the Guild. I've mentioned a couple of times, if you're not aware, we are hosting the first xAPI user conference at DevLearn this fall, next month in Las Vegas. And we are just announcing that xAPI Hyperdrive applications are open as part of that experience. If you're not familiar with xAPI Hyperdrive, it's going to be part of the user conference. And Hyperdrive is a fast-paced competition where a number of people will be giving very quick some very quick presentations on how they're using xAPI in their organizations and the value that it's driven. They'll be giving it to the audience so they can learn from these case studies. But they'll also be presenting them to a panel of judges that are going to judge their presentations and the projects that they're sharing on a host of different criteria so that we can give awards based on the best applications of xAPI during Hyperdrive. We're really looking forward to that as being a major part of the xAPI user conference. Great opportunity to learn from the people who are using it, as well as showcase the work that people are doing in their organizations. We just opened up the call for proposals for applications. If you're interested in submitting an application for consideration to be part of Hyperdrive, you can submit a project online. I'll put the link into chat as soon as we're finished here. But great opportunity here. And if you want to learn more about the xAPI user conference or Hyperdrive or any of the other stuff that we have going on at DevLearn around xAPI, after this session, there are tables that you can join where you can meet with other people. There'll be one labeled xAPI at DevLearn that I'll be at, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. In addition, I also want to remind you there's a host of additional resources on our website, learningguild.com, around that can help you take a deeper dive into xAPI, bridging some of the gaps that are going on between some of the sessions. If you're not already a member, go to learningguild.com and join. It is a completely free membership. And like I said, there's a host of different resources that are available on xAPI. One of the other things that we're doing, I had some conversations with some attendees after last week's session, and I realized that for some of you, that especially those of you that are brand new to xAPI, there's a lot to take in. And we hit the ground running within the cohort. So we're in the process of curating a foundational element of resources that people can use to learn a little bit more about the basics of xAPI and some of the stuff that's available that can help you jumpstart your education there. And I want to thank a lot of the speakers that are part of this cohort. I reached out to them last week asking if any of them had resources, and a lot of them shared some great resources that are going to be part of that curated list. So you can expect that to be coming very soon for those of you that are looking for a little bit more of a foundational resource to give you some more opportunities to jump into xAPI. But before we do any of that, again, any questions you have, I'll be at the table after the session. We are pleased to be welcoming Paul Schneider from Domino today for this week's session, exploring how to learn to send xAPI data. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I will go ahead and get right into it. And I suppose, first off, my background, I'm not in a jungle right now, but sometimes it feels like you're in a jungle when you're learning xAPI. And so that's kind of why I picked that background today. But let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll talk a bit about sending xAPI data. Okay, and get out of the mirror screens there for you. So you should be seeing, yep, looks like it is coming right through. And so today, I just want to give you an overview of what we'll cover here is what do you need to get started in sending your xAPI data? How do you connect to an LRS, a learning record store, which you all been learning about for that? And we're going to take a look at authoring tools because authoring tools are the easiest way to send it. So I'm not going to, for those of you who wanted to get into the coding and wanted to code it through JavaScript, I'm not going to really talk about that, but I'll talk about some different things related to it. How does that help you? And then we'll look at some different tools. Did a lot of research with some other groups in past cohorts. Thankfully for that, we're going to all benefit from it. And we'll look at automatic statements. In other words, just use it and it happens, as well as custom xAPI statements and how to connect to a learning record store. There's different ways to do it with the authoring tools. We'll also look at, just very quickly, talk about, if we have time, some out-of-the-box examples that I've put together. as well as a couple tools that I found and that will kind of help you out. And some of them you may be aware of too, in case the out-of-the-box stuff for your authoring tool that you either have to use or, this is an opportunity to try new tools too. That's what you want. So first off, I'm glad you're all here in the cohorts. And one of the things about the cohorts, and this is one of our philosophies too, is work together better. First of all, several cohorts that I've worked with in the past and individuals have helped to contribute to the knowledge presented here. This is not all me. Again, so together we're better with that. So first of all, what are the pieces of the puzzle here? So we're used to, hey, there's an LMS out there and we typically have an authoring tool. We publish it, usually goes into the LMS, sends SCORM information, sometimes AICC if we're using that. Well, in this particular case, we also have our third component that we're looking at is a learning record store. Now, as some of the past presentations might have mentioned, sometimes that LMS has a learning record store in it. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you can use both at the same time, but it's partly figuring out how can you go ahead and get it connected. To use a baseball analogy, the authoring tool is pitching out the information. And then in the case of the LMS or the LRS, that's what the catcher is receiving that information. So the first thing is, how do I connect a course and an LRS? Sometimes it's as easy as in the authoring tool, you simply publish it as an xAPI package. And in that case, you would also end up loading it into usually an LMS that has an LMS and LRS together. Or there are some LRSs out there where you can load the full package in it. So this is a possibility in some cases. And then really you just upload it like SCORM and it sends the data and sends it there. There may be some restrictions to it. There may not be, but the key is you need to have both the authoring tool that publishes an xAPI package or CMI5 if you're getting into that, and the LMS or LRS that will allow you to host the package there. So if your system doesn't have that, or one of your system doesn't, that doesn't mean you're out of luck. You can also use a part of xAPI is something called an LRS endpoint. And so basically it's a URL to where you can say, hey, if you send information to this address, we're going to collect it and then make it available for reporting, which is pretty awesome because it allows you to send that information not only in through a lot of different authoring tools. Some make it a little more challenging to configure it, some don't. But it allows you to send that information in from other sources. Some of the past cohorts, there was one where they used those cards that you would go through to get access to a room. And that card sent data because it had a web app and sent that over to an LRS endpoint. And then the cool thing is that because there's two different ways in, you can also, again, sometimes this requires programming, sometimes it's an out-of-the-box feature. But if you have an LMS that doesn't support xAPI or says it does, but it does it poorly, and you have another learning record store, you can also put a SCORM package into a system and at the same time potentially send LRS data out. Sometimes you need a third-party app, or like I said, sometimes it's part of the solution. But you have multiple ways to send that information out. So when you send out xAPI statements, of course, one way you could do it, as I mentioned, is hand code everything. But as much as I like coding, and I have coded in the past, and I still do on occasion, it's really nice if you can get your authoring tool to do the heavy lifting. Just like very few of us will use Dreamweaver or some other HTML editor to go ahead and manually create a course to create actions and triggers. We use the authoring tools to do that. You can get your authoring tool do that. And the nice thing is, these days, they're all at least doing the basic stuff. So that means that the basic stuff is taken care of for you. It's, of course, we want to get past the basic stuff. I mean, that's why we got an xAPI where there's a little bit more challenge. But fortunately, even since I last gave this talk, similar talk with some other folks. There have been some improvements. Unfortunately, in some cases, there haven't been any changes, but at least we all have a base to work with. So I put together some charts, or rather I should say a team of folks put together actually for a previous cohort. And then we actually had a follow-up where some of the same team members and some additional team members put together an updated version of that. I looked through it there, and as best I can tell, there were a few changes to some of the tools out there, but not too many changes since the last update. And by the way, this is one link and one of the several links. In fact, all the links here in this presentation I have given to David, so they're available here. But this is a summary of that was published in Learning Solutions magazine. So this lists out some common tools. If your tool's not there and you use a lot of it, I'd love to hear about it. Talk to me, and maybe we can get that added to the list and work with David, and we get an updated version of this publication pushed out. But these are some common tools that the different folks we worked with presented there and actually did the research on. And so we broke it up into some different areas. So one thing that's not terribly exciting, but all the tools do, is did you access a page? And basically they give a statement usually of I've experienced this. So every time a user goes out to any page in your course, you're going to say they've experienced that. And as if you know from SCORM or AICC, it doesn't include that. So you know they've touched the page, and that is a step forward there. Another item that out there is practice questions. And when I'm talking about those, I'm talking about those knowledge checks to get immediate feedback, not a part of an overall scored exam. A couple tools out there, Domino One and Smart Builder, they automatically do that. So just by using their xAPI features, you can get those results. And then as we look into other things there, we're seeing that, unfortunately, there's not a lot of automatic. There is some tools that have that allow you to do that and get it in there as far as does it automatically do that. There are also some unique items. So each tool is going to have unique capabilities to do different types of actions and triggers and other things in there. But when it comes to xAPI, there are some unique items, and we've listed that out there. I'm not going to, in the interest of time, go through all this, but we'll make this available. And then when I'm talking about course structure and metadata completion, we're talking about, hey, is it just reporting things at the top course level or just page level, or is it going into other metadata like a learning objective or modules or things like that? And some of the tools will go ahead and give you some additional details there. Next section we looked at was, for me, some pretty exciting things about xAPI, and not naturally speaking, there's some capabilities there. One was the ability to create custom statements. And so the other ones we were looking at the previous screen, these are things, just use the authoring tool and then we get data, which is pretty awesome. The next is, well, I want, when I'm doing certain things, for when they do a certain thing, to send a statement, and I want to send a specific verb, specific action, maybe some variable data or something to it. And then, of course, it triggered by the fact they clicked on something or something happened on the page. And so the good news is that most of the tools have added that in. So that was an improvement that I saw since the last couple of years. So you have the ability, usually using the same action trigger capability to like hide an item on a page or show it, to go ahead and fire off a custom xAPI statement. And there are some variations in the tools and in terms of their capability, but generally speaking, they're very similar in that. Another way to do it, and this is a common way to do it if it's not doing everything you want, is, hey, I'm going to write my own custom xAPI. And so with that, essentially, you have to execute a JavaScript command or statement or whatnot. Most of the tools have that capability to go ahead and do that. So you could, if you want to get into the code, write out some things that way or supplement it that way. One of the most exciting things about xAPI is it's not just about sending data, it's also about receiving data. Unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of movement, or at least I've not. If you all have, I'd love to hear some case studies on this, but it's about taking that data that's in the LRS and then maybe using it to make changes in a course. Could be a leaderboard showing up. And I've seen actually some of the xAPI cohort members in the past, they did do exactly that. They had a leaderboard show up, or it could be a polling activity. Unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of out-of-the-box tools available for that. Domino has one capability for adaptive learning based on passing an objective. It'll automatically pull it out of a course for you if it's reused in another one. And then Smart Builder actually has some actions and triggers around that is probably the most flexible to have an out-of-the-box option there. Of course, you could still do that using that custom JavaScript, but again, then you're writing and receiving that information and pulling that out for that two-way communication in xAPI, which again, something that's completely different than any of the types of things that you could do with SCORM or AICC. We talked about setting a learning record store endpoint at the beginning. And in some cases, you're just going to publish it as an xAPI package and load in the system, and great when that works there. In other cases, you may want to use an LRS endpoint in combination or not. Some tools have that automatically built in. Some have it, but you need to post-publish, make some adjustments to it and some configurations. And some just don't really have it. Although, some tools say Lectora, it's very flexible. So if you really know what you're doing, you can do things even if it has a no on there. So a little caveat should be an asterisk there. But that explains a little bit about that. Another unique thing about xAPI is typically in a SCORM or xAPI, we think, hey, I'm going to send this data right off to the LMS. And you only have one LMS. But of course, sometimes some organizations have 2 LMSs, 3 LMSs, and you load the course in the second or third or fourth. And then you have 2 separate data points or 3 or 4. Maybe you have a reporting engine that pulls it all together through unique APIs and stuff like that. Well, with xAPI, it does have the ability through that LRS endpoint is your content could be sending data off to 2, 5, 20 LRSs all at the same time. With some of the tools here, they have that actually built in, and you can just configure it or adjust it after publish. Some don't. Again, you could go into code and manage it there, but that allows you to actually send data to multiple locations. Obviously, that's a unique situation, but if you're in that situation, it's pretty darn important. However, I will say there is a workaround for that, and that's a cool capability in learning record stores, is learning record stores, most of them have the capability to forward or send information from one learning record store to another. So that's an easy workaround if your learning record store supports it and you do want to get it to another one. So the nice thing about xAPI, it's a lot more flexible and a lot more compatible than we're used to. The other situation that I saw at the very beginning when xAPI came out, and to me, from what I see today, is still really relevant is, hey, I got an LMS. I still need to publish it as a SCORM package, but I want to start getting xAPI data. How can I do both? And I've seen different folks create little plugins that can do both at the same time and put that in. But some of the tools have added in that capability so you can actually do both at the same time. And if you're in that situation where you want to move forward, but you can't ignore the reality of your present, which is SCORM only interface, or you're trying to go ahead and do a proof of concept and getting the freebie LRS light or whatnot, but you still need to have that data on SCORM. Well, this is the one way that you could go ahead and do that. So that's pretty cool to enable you to do that. Another thing, it's called an xAPI wrapper. And in plain English, that's the wrapper around the package that is included to send that xAPI information, the configuration associated with it. In most cases, you'd be like, why do I even have to worry about that? And in most cases, yes, it's like SCORM, it's wrapped automatically. A few are slightly different in that or don't include that wrapper. That can present a bit of challenge for you. It doesn't mean there isn't a way to work around it, but if it's not included, that just means one more step. Now, fortunately, most of these one more steps, once you've done it, it's the same thing over and over again. But just keep that in mind when you're working with those packages. One of the other things I wanted to mention was, hey, I got an authoring tool and I'm working on it, and it's not sending everything I want. Well, of course, you got the execute JavaScript. You can pull in those different commands, etc. there. But there are a couple extensions I found. And honestly, if anybody knows of any other ones, I'd love to hear about it too. As I've not seen a lot out there. But one is a great one from Torrance Learning. It's specifically only for Storyline, but given Storyline has the basics and a custom statement, it adds a lot more to it. It's basically a plugin you can tie in, and it'll do a lot more automatic things for you in your Storyline package. And then we didn't mention this as another authoring tool, but there's something called Adapt Learning. It's an Adapt framework, and that's a responsive tool out there. And there is a GitHub contribution to add xAPI support for that. And then, of course, if you haven't already figured out, I'm not a big Slack user, but I know on the Slack channels, there is a lot of code snippets and different ideas from other participants in the past who have contributed all sorts of different things that you could plug in. Like I'm pretty sure that leaderboard I talked about was shared in the past. Looks like we have yes. So there's a question out here, and this is from David a little bit earlier on. So he's asking, hey, you're looking to transfer learner data from your LMS to your CRM. Is it best practice to use an LRS built into the LMS or look to use an external LRS? So let's just kind of talk a little bit. So to be clear for folks on the phone or on the meeting here, LMS, Learning Management System, that's typically what you load your content into and what you launch it through, your SCORM packages, etc. Your LRS, again, that's Learning Record Store on there. And your CRM, well, Customer Relationship Management, I think I'm remembering it correctly. I always call it CRM, so I forget the lingo on there. Is how do you get the data from one to another on that? And there aren't any direct links into CRM, but it really, what you want to think about is, how am I getting that xAPI data? If you're getting that xAPI data easily into the LMS, then probably what you want to do is, how can I link that LMS data to the CRM? And in the case of a lot of the LMSs out there, they do have either built-in or partnerships, at least with some of the bigger CRMs, to get information and put it. A lot of times you need to get that the student information, the learner information from it. If you're sending it directly through the LRS, the one nice thing about the LRS is I wouldn't try to send it back into the LMS probably, because the LRS data itself is in a pretty modern format, and it's likely there are some transfer type tools where you could go ahead and bring that into a CRM. Hopefully that answered your question, David, but if not, I'll follow up. Okay, got another good question. This is from Abigail. What would it look like if we loaded KPIs for new hires into an LRS that a manager could check off that they demonstrated? That might be more of an LMS related question. Well, and to the LMS or where you would put that in, it often gets down to how you break up your KPIs. And so if you had a KPI at a project level, in other words, a course level, then, hey, completing that in and tying it in and feeding it to the LRS, that's kind of easy. But usually KPIs are tied to parts of a course or parts of multiple courses. And that's where I'm going to just go back, because it does speak to a structure item. For example, Domino 1, one of the advantages with their advanced xAPI capability, and full disclosure, I do work for Domino, so I know a bit more about that one. But one of the things that they'll track is your learning object. And so you could tie your KPIs to objectives, which you could have 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 objectives in a project. And it could go ahead and tie that information and send, oh, you've completed that learning objective KPI, and that could be sent directly to the learning record store. Now, likewise, if you have a different tool, you could use a custom statement and kind of just tie it in manually based on however you're dividing the course. But in Domino, they have it kind of structured in such a way that you could tie it that way. You still need to think about your KPIs and design your KPIs into the course, of course, if you will. Not sure if that answers your question, Abigail, but please comment back if any other questions. And Joe mentioned that's not really true. Lectora supports all those items. And so that may be, I actually kind of checked out the Lectora's website, so maybe some of the documentation haven't been updated, but definitely go ahead, Joe. Let's get some updated in there, because if we get an article out there, I'd love to add that information in. I know Lectora was one of the first ones to get a out-of-the-box trigger, so you could do custom xAPI statements, and it's super flexible. It's even more flexible than some of the other ones. But yeah, if they have some other out-of-the-box items, let's get them in there, because I did not see those, because I was looking. I thought they might have done there, but definitely didn't see it. But might have just been looking at out-of-date documentation. Oh, and Cornerstone LMS, folks out there, all I can say is they say they support xAPI, but they do put limits on it, and it probably would not pass a conformance test. One of the cool things that's been out there in the last couple of years is there's now a conformance test where you can actually test a learning record store and see if it complies to all the requirements and be conformant. You can do that with authoring content, but it's not as plug and play as easy to do it there. Let's go ahead and take a look at some ideas, hopefully for you there. And this is by no means an endorsement of Veracity or Domino One or anything. It's just the ones that I had handy, and just to show you off some ideas of things you could think about. So the first one that we're seeing in the screenshot, this is the type of thing that actually, if we look back at the automatic output for all the authoring tools, all of them are providing automatic output for question details. There might be a little bit variance between what they provide, but the standard's pretty straightforward on it, and it follows SCORM pretty closely on it, so it's easy to match that in. But you could start to create reports in your learning record store. These reports were created in Veracity, and just pulling out different question reports based on different types of questions. You could break it down by questions there, or you could break it down and look at item analysis, depending on how you break it there. And then, what kind of graphing and these things that show up, that's not an xAPI thing per se, but those are all things that you can bring in if your tool provides it. Now, that being said, I've also seen folks take it from an LRS and export that xAPI data off into a BI tool, such as Microsoft BI, and built reports out of there. But this is a common one that you could bring in, and very useful. In fact, a lot of the learning record stores are starting to make some of these as their standard out-of-the-box reports. Oh, yes, and Ginger put in the chat, thanks for bringing that up. Storyline 3, Storyline 360, they're pretty much the same things. When it comes to xAPI, they are. There are some differences from the tool themselves, but when it comes to xAPI, pretty much the same thing. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Here's another one. So this was a course that I built with some of my team members. Just a simple Jeopardy. You ask the different questions and you get points. In this particular case, we did build on Domino, and we took advantage of some automatic statements and some custom statements. And what we did was, hey, and the custom statements were when you clicked on 100 and you got it right. And again, you could do this with, again, most of the tools out there because they support custom statements. When you got it right, it automatically sent a statement saying, of course, it already knew who you were because it brings that in as the actor automatically for you. So no one has to do this. But it then just sent the variable, because in the system, it had a variable that was $100 or $200, that you got $100, and set the description was, whatever the test question data was. So, or not the test question, but, the Jeopardy answer. Another item too was, hey, if you ran out of time, it sent another custom statement just saying, hey, this is how much this was worth. And they lost that much money, if you will. And the reason they lost it was a timer expired. So again, you provide that data. And of course, provided how much money you dated, or not dated, but lost. And then how much money you won for each different event. And so you kind of go through that. And then also included another custom statement of What's the running total of winning? So from all that data, you can just imagine you can build in all sorts of graphs and data. You can start to see patterns. And where this could be really interesting, and this is what I love about xAPI, is it's about big data in the end. And so big data, sure, it's looking at what Johnny did, but it's looking at trends and seeing, hey, what things are really coming out of the wash, if you will. And so this is something where you could see a pattern on there. And as some of us who watch Jeopardy know, is that some people learn that, oh, if you were answering this way, you can win a lot more. And of course, that's how we got some of the last winners that won so much money. These were some reports that some of our friends over at Watershed threw together for that, just to go ahead and see how people responded, their scores, times that came in, how many times they ran out of time for it, what their overall scores in comparison to folks were. So you could pull that out there. But they just took some of that data and pulled up different things. And really, it comes down to what you want to imagine and pull up there. And of course, your proficiency in that particular reporting tool, which may or may not be built into your learning record store. Let's see, it looks like there's a new questions or chat there. We're just checking that. David has a question. What about retrieving a learning record store xAPI data? Have rapid authoring tools been able to build primitive dashboards? Are we embedding? Yeah, like Yet and Veracity to display them. So David is unfortunately are we still stuck here? Yes. So that, let me just pop back to it because we had a little bit on it and I don't want to take away from any of the tools that have them. So this was the two-way. So David's really talking about retrieving data in here. And so Domino does have one built-in widget. It's basically to create adaptive learning. So if you took one course that had some of the same skills as a second course, that second course could be shorter automatically by the fact that you passed the skills in a previous course. So it automatically pulls that out. And that's actually doing that. It's going out to the learning record store, pulling in that data and saying, hey, they've already completed those, and automatically removing it from the course. And Smart Builder has a state API and activity profile blocks, so you can build some of that type of stuff, but they don't have any built-in widgets there. But beyond that, which isn't really much change in the last couple years, no other tools have added, and those tools haven't added any additional pieces. So back to your point was, hey, are we still embedding HTML extensions into it, or things that were built in the LRS and bringing in some data that way? Yeah, you're doing that, or building in those different tools, at least from everything I've seen there. But if other folks on there, like Ether and Brothers there, know that there's some automatic things out released, let us know about those. This was, and Abigail, I answered a little bit of this question there, but I see there's a comment on it there about the KPIs and checkoffs. I will tell a good story of actually someone I talked to, and actually they were at DevLearn. This is a couple years ago, and they were building a course, and they wanted to do actually KPIs as a man. I'm sorry, I misread your question, Abigail, but they wanted a manager to be able to, as they observed someone, check off different things. Well, I mean, other than maybe they checked off everything, you can't really track that in SCORM. Well, in xAPI, you can. And so what they did, and let me go back to our screen here too, where that kind of ties in. Unfortunately, well, there is one tool out there. Smart Builder has this built in, but essentially you could do it a couple different ways. One is you could, using form controls in an authoring tool, build in those checkoffs. And then you could use custom xAPI statements, which most of the tools, at least all the tools that let you do form controls, do have custom xAPI statements. And then when they check off each individual item, it's just going to send a statement that they've done, or what sometimes is a little bit better, when they've done with all of them, then it will look at those and send multiple statements at once. So you can kind of decide when to send it. So you essentially build a screen with those checkoffs in there, and they use it just as they would be checking it off. One other way that people have done it is if you come back to here and we talk about test questions, and I mentioned that, let's go back over where I mentioned test questions. Not sure where I have it there, but all the tools pass the test question data. If your test question data also allows you to have survey type questions that you can use to check off KPIs, you could go ahead and create a KPI like that. And then you would be sending off that data and sending that right to an LRS. So those are two good ways to do it. And I've definitely seen some folks out there do exactly that. And even if you have to do the custom statements, those are built-in actions and triggers. It's a bit extra of a step there, but it's not that hard. You don't have to do any programming to go ahead and accomplish that with most of the tools that are out there today. Let's just go back, and I think I just had one last thing. Was how was it done? Just to show you a little bit on those items. For the out-of-the-box objective, the tool has an interface where you just create your objectives. You have multiple ones available there. It has a learning object structure where you can go to the properties of that objective, pick off one of those as this meets the identifying security threats. And then when you publish it, you can say, hey, I want it to automatically adapt either in the same project or across any project published in Domino. And then when they go ahead and publish that, it automatically adapts. And so that's one of those cases that David was talking about, where it's reading in data, it's sending data to the learning record store, and then later on retrieving that Paul or John or Sally actually completed that particular objective. And this was a report. Again, Watershed just pulled up that information and then was showing, hey, how many people completed each particular objective. You could even go ahead and start to pull up information like, hey, did Paul complete it when they were taking course A or when they were taking course B? So those are the types of things that you can really start to expand and, like I said, open your mind to in terms of the capabilities. And I mentioned these resources. I did share all of them with David too, so I think they'll be part of the compiled information there. But let's just check and see if there's any other questions in the chat or anything else that people wanted to review or had questions on. Yeah, for those out there getting started, I saw some of the other folks that presented. Watch the recordings on some of those. Those are going to be great. It's really helpful to at least to understand what a statement is. Hey, it's an actor, it's a trigger, an action there. But then I would say just start with the out of the box. No matter what authoring tool you have, it has some out of the box, and then load that into either a free access at Squirm Cloud, Veracity, Watershed. They all have different free options there. Send those statements over there and just get a feel for it. But then also join in one of the cohorts or a couple of them there. That's the best way to learn, because there's probably going to be some people that know more, or there's going to be a bunch of folks that don't know as much, but together you can accomplish a lot more. I was talking with David earlier, finding the time to do this is difficult, but another thing of working with other folks is you'll be able to go ahead, well, I'll do this one little piece and you do that little piece, and then get down there. Just checking, David, did you see any other questions I missed in the chat?
I did not. It looks like you've been on top of the Q&A, but I didn't see any other questions. I just saw something else popping up in Q&A, though.
Excellent. And as I said, too, I'm always looking to learn more about other tools. And if there's folks out there, the gentleman from eLearning Brothers there has some more updates about any particular tool that they use, and we're out of date on that. Let's get that information so I can update my presentation. And then, like I said, I'm sure we can work with David to get a updated from 2019 to 2022 version update of these. Because I did update some of these here, so there's some difference from the 2019, but I suspect there's a few more.
So I want to be conscious of time. I did see two more questions come in. First one here, can you give some other examples of how retrieving xAPI has been used to great effect? I
saw one of them. Well, I didn't see this used, but they talked about it. So when I talked about the KPIs and the managers checking off that, one of the things they talked about is having another course or dashboard, however you want to think about it, where the learner, or not the learner, but the actual employee could go ahead and look up their own data. So in that particular case, they would have a course, and of course it knows who they are because they launched it, and then it would reach out to the LRS and retrieve that KPI data. Likewise, if you're thinking about that, hey, how did you do 6 months ago? Again, that's another, you could pull that 6 months KPI data. Again, I didn't see that done, but they were talking about doing that. Another one is, of course, we have all sorts of great polls to do polling out there. Polling's another one that could be built in to xAPI to pull that data back. Another one, it's just a different aspect of gaming and bookmarking. But if you're doing any type of exercise where you're doing gaming and you want to have other folks involved, of course, we talked about the leaderboard. That's kind of the out of the box one where you can pull that data in. But maybe what some other people are doing will contribute to it. Now, do we want to be like a multi or a mud? Probably not. But if there's certain things that certain groups are doing together, especially in the remote world, they could be pulled in that way. But beyond, as far as what I've seen other folks do, those are the ones that I've seen. But really, any of that data can be pulled back to. So it's kind of just getting around there and pulling it in. Unfortunately, pulling it in does require some JavaScript and stuff. So,
and that actually is a good segue to the last question that I saw come into chat. You mentioned JavaScript, but you also have used throughout this talk, when you're describing different tools, the phrasing out of the box. What do you mean in the context of xAPI when you describe a tool as being out of the box?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. When I say out of the box, I mean, you might know the word JavaScript, you might not even know what it means. But when you're using it, you just need to know how to use that tool. So you're not doing any JavaScript, you're not unpackaging things, repackaging, putting anything in there. You're just using out-of-the-box functionality. Now, when you get to the out-of-the-box custom statements, you're still using actions and triggers that are out of the box in that authoring tool, but it does help to understand verbs and types in xAPI, because you're going to pick some of those and perhaps understand variables because you may want to store and put data in there. But to be clear, you're not using any JavaScript in that case. When you start to move beyond that, that's where you're using JavaScript. And some of the tools allow you to automatically put that JavaScript into the tool. Other tools make it next to impossible or very difficult. But in that case, you're definitely programming and bringing something in.
Wonderful. All right. Well, that's a great close to the end of our time here. Paul, I want to thank you so much for sharing with us this year today.
Well, hey, thanks for having me, everyone. And I look forward to hearing more from you. I'm going to try to pop into Slack a bit more often and just get out there and try it and start small because there's a lot to do, and don't tackle too much first.
Excellent. And I want to remind everyone, speaking of Slack, that our Slack channel is a great place to go to just find some of the projects that are going on so that you can just go out there and play a little bit in a safe space.
I will. One quick thing I just remembered. I saw one other example because we built it together as far as polling data. We did a course where you had to take an xAPI security, and then when you passed, it recorded that information in. You took a second, you got an email from the security team, and it was a fake phishing email. If you fell for it, when you clicked on the email, it went out to the Learning Records store and marked that you did not have credit, and then automatically through the LMS assigned you to a refresher course. So that just gives you an idea of that back and forth, and it's really fun what you could potentially do to make sure people have done it.
Excellent. All right. Well, again, Paul, thank you so much for joining us here today. As a reminder for anyone, if you have questions about the cohort or xAPI Hyperdrive that I mentioned at the beginning, or anything that's going on at DevLearn or at xAPI, I will be at one of the tables after this session that says xAPI DevLearn. And if you want to continue the conversations amongst yourselves in the time that we have left, feel free to create a table there yourself. Thank you again for joining us for this week's cohort session. We'll see you next week. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.